The shadows and highlights sliders in Lightroom versus the curves adjustment panel. Do you know what they're actually doing? Well, what I've discovered this week might change how you edit in Lightroom forever. Hello, welcome to In Studio. I'm Ian M. Butterfield. I have a weekly Sunday night live stream, and as part of that I accept questions from the viewers. One question came from viewer Gary Platt, who asked what I thought was a really simple, straightforward question. He asked me about the differences between the sliders in the basic panel of Lightroom and the curves adjustment panel. But before I gave an answer, I wanted to do a few tests just to confirm what I thought I knew. Well, when I did those tests, I was really surprised at what I discovered. You could almost say I was shocked at what I'd found out. And that information is going to change how I work with Lightroom from this point onwards. So stick with this video right to the end, and I'll tell you how it's going to affect my use of Lightroom and how it might well affect your use as well. Understanding histograms. To follow what I'm explaining on this video, you need at least a very basic understanding of histograms. I am in the process of working on a video which goes through all the different types of histograms and how you interpret them. And when that video is released, you'll find a link for it, well, somewhere up there. But for the purposes of this video, just a basic understanding will suffice. So let's pop over into Photoshop and I'll just go through the essentials to do with histograms. Here in Photoshop, I've got an image of a bride from a wedding shoot that I did. Let's open the histogram for that. So Window, Histogram. Now mine is a little pop-out window. You may find in your case it turns up on the panel on the right-hand side. I've pulled it out just so that it's a little bit clearer. Now what the histogram is it's a graph of brightnesses along the bottom versus number of pixels with that brightness on the up axis, with 0 or the darkest pixels on the left and the brightest on the right. So we can see in this image that we've got a huge number of pixels which are almost pure white, and that will relate to this big bright area behind our bride. Then we've got a number of pixels which are bright but not pure white, and this huge grey peak. So where's the grey? Well, actually the grey is this area down below. It's the wedding dress. It's not pure white because it's in shadow, so that is represented by the peak in the middle. And then we get fewer and fewer dark pixels with just a very few really black pixels at the left-hand side. And that will correspond to the dark areas in the bouquet and the dark hair on our bride. Let me give you another example. This image is one you may have seen if you've watched my video on dynamic range. And if you want to see that video, you'll find a link to it again somewhere up there. Let's head back into Photoshop and I'll just talk about the histogram for this image. Now we can see on this image that we've got two peaks. The main peak is over on the left-hand side, which is pure blacks and almost pure blacks, and that corresponds to the dark areas here at the bottom of the image, the black area behind our actress. There's very little in the mid-tones, there are a few pixels there, and that will correspond to parts of the dress, the face tones. And then when you get to the really bright areas, there is a smaller peak which corresponds to the candle that's lit there. The test image. To test what's going on in Lightroom, I needed an image that I could track what was happening with the different brightnesses. So instead of using one of the images we've just seen or picking any other random image, I created a test image specifically for this job. Let's go back over into Photoshop and I'll just talk you through the test image and how Photoshop responds to it. This is my test image and it's 16 bars of different brightnesses. They're all monochrome, and looking from the left, the bar on the left has a color value of 000000. Next one is 111111, then 2222 22 333333, so on, all the way up to, on the right hand side, a value of FF in terms of hex. Now how that's represented in a histogram is we have 16 peaks, all the same size because each of these rectangles is the same size, with effectively one value's width. So I have the one here represents the black on the left hand side, the one here represents the white on the right hand side, and then there is one for each of these different shades of grey in between. So that's our test image. I've saved it as a PSD file so that there's no data being lost through lossy compression on there. And what I want to do is show you what happens to this image and what happens to the histogram when we do some basic adjustments here in Photoshop. Adjusting the exposure in Photoshop. I've put two adjustment layers over the image. Neither of them are enabled at the moment, and the control properties are up above. So that's the control properties for exposure, that's the one for curves. So let's just enable the exposure one, and let's move this property dialog box next to the histogram so we can see what's going on as we adjust things. So in exposure, as I bring the exposure down, watch each of those peaks as they represent each of the bands of my image. And you can see that they all bunch up towards the left. They remain as a single value, which means that the value of all the pixels within each band is remaining the same, and they're just getting closer and closer together. If I increase the exposure, you can see they come further and further apart until we get back to a value of 0. Curves adjustments in Photoshop. The curves adjustment is a very powerful tool for adjusting the exposure of an image in post-production. Let me show you how it works in Photoshop. Let's turn off that exposure adjustment layer and enable the curves adjustment layer. The curves adjustment layer is again another graph, but it's an interactive graph. Along the bottom we have our input, and we have a line which indicates how we're translating the input value to an output value. So at the moment it goes from bottom left to top right. So if we look at this mid-grey value here, we can see that a mid-grey value on the input comes out as a mid-grey value on the output. But if I grab hold of this line in the middle and just move that point all the way up, what you can see is this what was mid-grey is now going to be translated to being a much brighter grey, and a darker grey becomes a lighter one, and it's basically just a chart explaining how values along this axis are translated to values on this axis. Now if you look at that on our histogram, as I brought that up, what it did is it bunched together all the values up at the top, and you can see it here on the histogram. Those values get close together. Each of these really are still separate, so we've got pure white, we've got just below there, and you can see here how that's just off there. In fact, each of these lines represents one of the panels in my test image, and you can see that the end one is pure white. The next one's almost pure white, but not quite, and just a little bit further down. There's not much change until you come down the curve, and then it becomes a bit steeper as we get down towards the bottom. And looking on the histogram, we can see that close together and then getting further and further apart as we get down to black. The important thing to note about that histogram, though, is that each of those lines remains a single value line. And that means that all the brightnesses within each of those rectangles remain exactly the same throughout the whole area of the rectangle. I keep mentioning that for a reason. That will become much more clearer as we move over into Lightroom. So what happens in Lightroom? Right, I've brought my test image into Lightroom, and I'm in the library module to start with. Let's have a look at the histogram here, and a couple of things just to comment about on it. And that is that the peaks are not single value peaks anymore. Same image that we were looking at in Photoshop, but they're not single value peaks anymore. And in fact, the mid-grey appears very different to all the others of how those are displayed. Now, I'm not unduly bothered about that, because my understanding is that Lightroom will be generating its histogram from the lower res image that it uses in the cached image for it, the preview image. So I'm not unduly worried about that. What I am concerned about is how this is represented in the develop module. So let's go over to the develop module, D on the keyboard. And again, you can see the histogram here. Now this is a little bit more as I would expect. At least all the peaks are identical on there. They don't seem to be a single value, but that little bit either side, I believe, will be down to anti-aliasing when the cached image is generated. So I'm not worried about that at all. Let's consider it, let's give Lightroom the benefit of the doubt and say, yep, those are single value, or as near as damn it on there. Changing the exposure in Lightroom. Let's repeat the same tests that we did in Photoshop now in Lightroom and see what happens. When I adjust the exposure here in Lightroom, we can see exactly as before, all those peaks move in. Now, what is interesting here is to note that the peaks aren't all equidistant as I move them in. Much larger gap up here on the right-hand side. I'm guessing that looks like some form of logarithmic scale. Happy with that. They are kept as effectively single value items, so they are single peaks, all getting closer together, and the same happens going the opposite way. Eventually we'll get a point where the end ones would collide. So exposure is behaving as I would expect. Let's have a look at some of the other sliders in Lightroom and see how the histogram responds to those. Changing the contrast in Lightroom. As I move the contrast slider, if I move it down to the left, we are reducing contrast, which means, as you can see, the mid values are getting closer together, which means we are reducing contrast in the middle, but they're getting further apart at the edges, which means contrast is actually increasing at the edges. And go the other way, and you can see as we increase contrast in the middle, we get larger gaps between the peaks, but they get closer together at the two extremes where there is less contrast in there. So let's reset that. With the whites slider, as I move that up, you can see what happens is everything starts moving up towards the whites. Now, predominantly, you would have thought it was just the white end that's being adjusted, but if you notice, all of those peaks are moving. The ones closest to white are moving the most with the white slider, but the ones further away are also being adjusted. So don't be fooled into thinking whites only affects the whites. If we look down here, as we're doing this, even the ones in the dark areas are being adjusted with the whites slider. Similarly with the blacks, as I move the black slider, things over in the blacks area are all coming closer and closer together, but there is still a little bit of movement over at the whites end on it. So again, don't be fooled into thinking that whites and blacks only adjust white and black areas of the image. Curves adjustments in Lightroom. So here in the Curves panel, the Curves panel has actually just been updated with the latest release of Lightroom. It's cosmetic more than anything, a change to the user interface, a little bit cleaner and easier to use. We've got two different types of curve available to us. We've got the classic point curve, and we've got what they call the parametric curve. So the parametric curve basically gives us defined areas which relate to these four sliders: highlights, lights, darks and shadows. I'm going to start off with the point curve on here, and I'm going to do exactly as I did in Photoshop. Put a point in the middle and then just bring it up, and you can see each of those lines representing each of the panels just gets closer and closer together and behaves exactly as we would expect on there, and coming down as well. So that's all good. I'm just going to reset that back to linear and go over to the parametric, and you can see what's happening with the parametric. So the highlights is the section at the top on there, and as I adjust that, you can see that actually now I'm just adjusting the whiter areas, which is what I would have expected to be happening with the whites slider, but it's actually happening here with the parametric one. Let me reset that, double click on the word highlights, and with the lights you can see this is very similar to changing the exposure, but it's not going it's not affecting the dark areas very much at all. There's a little bit of adjustment down there, but it's more the lighter areas, and I've got a good deal of control. And again, notice single peaks on there. Again, I'll explain why that's the case later. Darks, similarly, is mainly the dark area that's being controlled, up and down on that. And the shadows, okay, just the darker areas being adjusted on there. So that's all well and good. That's behaving as we would expect. The $6 million question: what happens when I adjust the shadows slider or the highlights slider in the basic panel? Let's go over there and have a look. The shadow recovery slider. Watch the peaks in the histogram and watch the image as I adjust the shadows. I try to recover shadow information. So I bring it up. Notice that those peaks are no longer simple peaks, but they're flattening out. And the more shadow work I do, the flatter they become. And they start merging into each other. Now look at the image. And I thought it was an optical illusion when I first saw this. But actually, there is a gradation of brightnesses across each of these. And if I hold my cursor just this side, and you have a look below the histogram, we can see a value here of 61.3. As I move across, look what's happening. It's getting lighter as I move across. But all that started out as one single brightness. They are no longer even across. That accounts for what's happened here. But it's only affected the first half of them. If I just zoom out, you can see it has affected this half of the histogram, hasn't affected the black, the true black there. It's affected here. You can see that this goes from 27 at the left side all the way down to 23. So it's actually getting darker as you go across it. So what's actually happening here? Well, you can see with the shadow recovery that it's not affecting that brightness uniformly across the whole area. It's taking into account the brightnesses on either side of the pixels that we're adjusting. So in order to create the appearance of more contrast, what it's doing is it's lightening this side of the bar next to a darkened side of that, so that we get more of a contrast between the two. Similarly here and here. And this is what shocked me, because what I believed I was doing when I was using the shadows slider was I believed I was just adjusting the exposure of any pixels of that value, and that they were all going to be treated the same. The amount of adjustment that happens to any given pixel is dependent upon the brightness of the pixels which surround it. And that is the thing that shocked me, because that's not how I want Lightroom to work. That's not what I thought I was doing when I was adjusting an image. The highlight recovery slider. So as I adjust the highlights, as though I'm trying to pull back detail in a bright sky, as I bring those right down, we can see this flattening of those peaks. So we're getting this adjustment across them. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So the 9th band is where it's becoming most obvious. So 1, 2, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So here we can see the values go from 63.5 down to 60. I don't want Lightroom to treat identical pixels differently. I want them all to be treated the same. Because what's one of the more common things that we end up doing in Lightroom? We bring the highlights down, we bring the shadows up, and look what's happened on that histogram, how it's completely changed the information on there. So what's actually going on here? Well, these sliders aren't the same as doing a curve adjustment. They are designed with an algorithm behind them to extract detail from the shadows. And they are very, very good at that. And in some ways, they are actually better than doing it with curves. Real-world images. I've chosen two images which represent the two different ends of the spectrum when it comes to editing photographs. The first image is an image which has been, let's say, deliberately underexposed. It's actually a section of an HDR, but it's not uncommon for me and for other photographers to shoot images like this in camera because we need to protect the highlights, and then we're going to bring back all the shadow detail in post-production. So for that image, we're going to need a large range of adjustments. The second image of model Karen is one that is not far off being correct in camera. So I want to look at how the two different approaches, the shadows, highlights, sliders versus the curves, would work with these two images, and the lessons we can learn from that, and what this means for, certainly for my own post-processing as we go forward. Macclesfield Forest. And let's go into the develop module. Now, to save a little bit of time with this, I'm going to use snapshots that I've created. Now, this is the image as captured in camera. It's deliberately underexposed. The sky, we've got the detail there. We've got next to no detail in the shadows, and I want to recover that. So doing some basic adjustments to it without using either the highlights or the shadows, and without using anything on the tone curve, that's about the best I can come up with. So we have two options. We can then process this with the curves, or we can process it using the highlight shadow sliders. Let's do it first of all with the highlight shadow sliders. And using the sliders, this is what I get. And what, I don't know whether you spotted over on this side, but all I've done is bring the highlights way down and bring the shadows all the way up. And I get something which actually looks like an HDR image on there. So let me reset that back. And the only thing I'm taking off are the highlights and shadows, and they come off. Let's go over to the curves panel. And if I do the settings with curves, and basically I've done exactly the same. I've brought the highlights down and I've brought the shadows up. The image looks flat and distorted on there. It doesn't look good. So you can see the difference by toggling between them. That's with the sliders, that's with the curves. And I would say for this image, using the sliders, the highlights and the shadow recovery has done a much better job than I could ever achieve using the curves. It's, yes, it's an artificial look, but then that type of image and that type of processing is always going to have that slight artificial edge to it anyway, so it does it much better. A portrait of Karen. It's not far off being correctly exposed. Go to the basic panel, and without doing very much to it, just a minor tweak to the exposure was about all I did with it. We have an image that is okay, but I would like to just bring down a little bit of the highlights, and I'd like to bring up a little bit more of the shadow detail on there. So doing it with the highlights and shadow sliders, I mean, it's okay. It's not bad at all, and that I would have been quite happy with. And you can see all I've done is a slight adjustment to the highlights, a slight increase to the shadows. So I just toggle between those two. you can see it's quite a subtle change. Hope you can see it on the video with just that slight change. However, if I want to try doing that with the curves, you see I've brought the shadows up a little way, brought the highlights down, comparable sort of changes to what I did with the sliders. I think the image is a little bit more pleasing on there. It's not quite as contrasty. I think it works a little bit better. I know I'm noted for having quite a contrasty look with my my images, but I've always strived to actually get it a little bit more realistic, and I actually quite like this as opposed to the version with the shadows and highlights. You see it's a bit more contrasty, and that's just a little bit more natural between the two. And that's the only difference, is which of those we've got on there. Summary. The two different ways of adjusting the highlights and adjusting the shadows give very different results. We've seen from the use of the test image and the histogram how those two recovery sliders, the highlight recovery and the shadow recovery, do more than just change the exposure. They adjust the whole area based on the brightness of the pixels which are around them. And that has an effect on the image. In some cases, I think that's a negative effect. In other cases, that algorithm has been designed to actually improve the image that we're working with. The sliders and using the curve to make those adjustments is a much more subtle approach. The changes are not quite so dramatic. So what this means is that if you've got an image like the one I had of the Macclesfield Canal that needs a lot of adjustment to it, then the way to go with that is probably to use the shadows highlight sliders, because it works better. The algorithm is designed to be able to cope with those bigger changes, but you're not going to get quite as naturalistic a look with it, which is fine when you're doing big changes. You're probably not looking for the naturalistic look. However, if you're working with an image like the one I have of Karen, then that needs a little more a gentle approach with it. It doesn't need big changes. So for those smaller changes, the curves is working better and giving a much more pleasing result, in my opinion. How does this change my post-processing? I am still going to use the shadows and highlight sliders, but I'm only going to use them when I need to make big changes. And that does happen quite a lot. Where I only need to make subtle changes, from this point on, I'm going to more head over to curves and do what changes I can there, with the knowledge that if it's not going to work for the big changes, but it's going to give me a better result on some of the portraiture work that I've done, or anything where my exposure in camera is pretty close to what I need. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future updates. If you want to learn more about editing in Lightroom, there's a playlist on the screen now. Until next time, keep making great photos, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.